Hi everyone, my name is Keith Friedlander and I'm going to be giving a presentation on the role of communal studios in combating precarious labor in the comics industry. I'd like to thank the organizers of the ICAF conference for inviting me to give this presentation and for inviting me again to give it in an online format. This is part of a larger research project that I began in 2019 with a series of interviews with some of the artists who work at these studios. Began as a project to better understand how these studios are operated and the place they hold in the comics world. But today I'm going to be focusing on specifically the role they play in terms of labor conditions. In their 2016 book Precarious Creativity, Michael Curtin and Kevin Sanson talk about labor conditions in creative industries. The chapters mainly focus on conditions in the film industry, but the general trend that they chart is that since the 1980s, globalization and outsourcing has generally led to worse working conditions in most media industries. Here they say conglomerates seek to contain production expenses by trimming budgets in other areas, especially below the line labor. As suggested above, the logic is manifested in new power plays aimed at increasing productivity and diminishing the wages of craft and service workers. So we see that, in the film industry and other creative industries, working conditions are getting worse as there is this effort from corporate to maximize profits while minimizing production costs, and that work conditions are becoming more precarious and more freelance. And one thing that I find interesting about the comic industry is that in a lot of ways it's ahead of the curve because working conditions in the comic industry have really always been precarious, and that as a result of that, comics professionals have a long history and a number of traditions in terms of coming up with strategies to cope with precarious labor and getting by. And one of those strategies is forming communal studios. This is one thing that comic artists do in order to help make ends meet and in order to survive their precarious working conditions is they get together, they pool their resources, they create places for themselves to work with their fellow artists. And there are lots of examples of this going back. These studios vary greatly in terms of size and organization. A communal studio could just be two or three artists splitting rent on a studio space so that they have some place to draw together. Or it could be a large studio with dozens of people participating that has a formal structure. But it really goes back throughout the history of the comic industry. So just looking at the 2010s, there was Pizza Island in Brooklyn, which was a number of women creators just kind of sharing a space as friends. So they had a place to create together. It's had, Lisa Hannawalt and Kate Beaton were there. If we go back further to the 1980s, there was Upstart Associates in Manhattan, which was a studio space that was shared by Walter Simonson and Frank Miller and a number of other prolific creators from the 70s and 80s. Of course, we can go even further back than that and look at Eisner and Iger Studios in the 1930s at the very outset of the comics industry. Eisner and Iger were a little different because they were actually trying to create a production studio. It was more of a formal business venture for them. But, Eisner and Iger were two out-of-work artists who said, hey, why don't we just pool our resources together, create a space of our own? And that's what all of these studios are. These are artists who are banding together to create the infrastructure and the supports that they're not getting from their publishers and their employers. This is a way of making ends meet and finding the resources that they need to be successful by collaborating and coming together and creating a shared space. Now, if we look at the current trends in the comic industry, it's kind of going in the opposite direction. Even though creative labor in the comics industry has always been precarious and artists have kind of always been on their own without a lot of support, it is, that general trend of decentralization and precarity and globalism that were discussed in Precarious Creativity also does map to the comic industry, that you have the creative labor is more dispersed and more spread out across the country. In 2003, Norcliffe and Randacci published their study of the changing geography of comic book production, where they just kind of noted that comic book artists are becoming more geographically spread out across the country. Here we see their map that was tracing the location of colorists who were working for Dark Horse Studios at the time. And you can see that although they're clustered in urban centers like Los Angeles and New York, they are also quite spread out. And as online capabilities has made it easier to work remotely, this trend has only kind of increased over the last 17 years. Dark Horse Studios is a publisher in Portland, but their artists are spread out all over the map. Now, Norcliffe and Randacci do note that despite this geographical distance, comic creation remains a collaborative art form. So given this dispersed residential pattern or independent artists, it may seem incongruous to state that comic book production is a highly social activity with creators operating reflexively. So even though they're spread out, they still are working together. And they go on to talk about how they do this through email and phone calls, and that the artists and writers are in touch with each other and still kind of collaborating on a day-to-day basis. But they're doing it geographically spread out. Now, that geographical distance does have consequences. If we look at the current state of the comics industry, we can look at the result of the Comic Workforce Survey that was conducted by Sarah Bassett in 2019. We see that nearly 83% of the artists who responded to that survey reported working from home. So you have the vast majority of comic professionals working in isolation away from any kind of coworkers or the rest of their creators in isolation in their home, and only less than 7% working in a shared studio or office. So that is the general trend. And that has consequences. So 63% of the respondents to David Harper's 2015 survey of comic artists reported that they worked more than 40 hours per week. And out of that 63%, more than a third of that number reported working more than 60 hours a week. And this is something that, statistically has been proven to happen, is that when people work from home, they are more likely to work overtime, to work in excess of 40 hours without any kind of financial reward. So they're just more likely to be exploited for their labor, in other words. Now, another study, Benjamin Wu's Erasing the Lines Between Leisure and Labor, found that 70% of comic professionals admitted that it was hard for them to say where work ends and leisure begins. And of course, that is also part of working from home, is that it becomes harder to distinguish between personal time and professional time. And of course, that's how you end up working 60 hours a week, is when you just don't have an end to your workday. And I think most comic professionals would say that, they love their work, they're doing it for the passion, they like creating, they like their art, but that willingness to work excessive hours in order to maintain that job is exploitive. And when you're working from home, you're more vulnerable to that. Another thing that Wu notes in his study is that the eagerness of comic professionals for their art form leads to a downward pressure on wages, that there are so many new young artists who are willing to work for less that it drives down the average wages of comic professionals. And of course, you're more vulnerable to being taken advantage of in terms of the wage you're willing to work for, again, when you're isolated. So these are all trends that communal studios can work against. And in the interviews that I did, I interviewed some artists from Helioscope Studio in Portland, World Monster HQ in Minneapolis, and Raid in Toronto. A lot of the benefits, one of the questions I asked is, why do you choose to work in a studio? What do you think are the advantages? And a lot of the benefits they listed really push against these exploitive trends that I just finished describing. So in terms of the benefits of a collaborative space, Some of the artists talked about, well, there's the ability to pick up work from their peers, that if you have a friend in the studio who gets offered a job that they don't have time for, you could pick up that work. So you're more likely to find work. You also have access to a group of people with different skills and backgrounds. So they talked about the advantage of, hey, this person has a background in animation, this person has a background in advertising, this person has a background in graphic design. And when you're pitching a comic series, having access to those people can be a real advantage as well. But most relevant to this presentation, they talked about the advantage of having access to a pool of industry knowledge, having a group of people together who know people in the industry and know what to expect from people in the industry. So Lucy Bellwood, who was one of the professionals I spoke to at Helioscope, said that the diversity and perspective in a single place and having the studio act as a sort of switchboard for resources and discussion was an advantage. That can range from anything from getting offered a freelance contract and pulling the room saying, hey, this guy wants to pay me $70 an hour. Is that reasonable? So again, if the studios, by creating a physical space where the comic professionals can come together, it ends that isolation of them working from home, and there are less likely to agree to exploitive work conditions. It was also an advantage in terms of lowering the barriers of entry into the industry. They talked about how, well, first of all, as I said at the beginning, these studios began as a way of mitigating the cost of urban living. It's expensive to live in big cities, but often you have to live in big cities to form connections in creative industries, and that sharing a studio space and splitting rent on those spaces is a way to help people get by. They also talked about how it's easier to table at conventions. Having a presence at comic conventions is important to starting a career and networking, but it's very expensive and cost prohibitive to do so. But if you're going to table at a convention as part of a group, well, first, it's easier to get the table if you're part of a group. You can split the cost of the tables if you're part of a group, and also you have a larger presence on the convention room floor if you're part of a group. So all those things made it easier to kind of start out on the convention circuit. And they also talked about how it can improve your representation with the industry. So Ramon Perez at RAID talked about how, Ramon Perez at RAID talked about how suddenly you're taken a little bit more seriously because you've organized yourself into a group and you present yourself as a collective. So when you're pitching a project and you say that you're part of the studio, then there's a little bit more recognition there. But these spaces also have limits, and they also have risks that are kind of endangering their existence. So one thing is that there's limited potential for them to serve as a replacement for labor organization, that these collaborative studio spaces can create safety networks for the people who work in them, but they can't necessarily provide employment benefits. They can't necessarily replace the benefits of being part of a union. So they're somewhat limited in that respect. But they're also threatened by rising rent costs and gentrification. You know, they exist in these urban centers that are hubs of culture and art, where rent costs have been going up dramatically over the last decade, and they're in danger of being priced out. And on the other hand, they're also endangered by the increasing accessibility of online work and remote work, that people can go and live in cheaper areas of the country. So Steve Lieber, who kind of runs Helioscope, talked about how it used to be he would advise young artists to move to New York and to, you know, try and get by and make connections there. And now his inclination is to tell someone to move to the cheapest place they can live and just, you know, go totally rural and live cheaply and just put your stuff online because it's just more economically feasible for young people. So rising rent costs are endangering the existence of these communal studios in large urban centers. It's becoming more and more difficult for them to exist. And so, you know, just thinking about the future trends of labor in the comic industry, I think it's useful to think about the role these studios could play in creating basic standards for fair labor practices. But in order to do that, they have to continue to be a place where comic artists can come together. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and thank you again to the organizers of ICAF.